This is the moment the American government collapsed under the weight of its own violence. At exactly 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, February 1st, 2026, the United States federal government officially shut down for the second time in 6 months, and this time the reason will shock you to your core. This is not about budget disputes or partisan politics. This is about two dead American citizens lying in the streets of Minneapolis, killed by their own government, and a president who has completely lost control of his own party. What happened in those final hours before the shutdown reveals a constitutional crisis so severe that it threatens the very foundation of American democracy, and the stunning betrayal that triggered it comes from the last person anyone expected. The cascade of events that led to this moment began 72 hours earlier when Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents in Minneapolis shot and killed Alex Jeffrey Priddy, a 37-year-old intensive care unit nurse who worked at a Veterans Administration hospital. Priddy was not a criminal. He was not undocumented. He was an American citizen whose job was saving the lives of American veterans, and he was murdered in broad daylight by federal agents for the crime of holding a cell phone. The video footage is undeniable. It shows Priddy standing on a Minneapolis street corner using his phone to document what appeared to be an immigration raid when Customs and Border Protection agents approached him. The video shows him raising his hands, clearly indicating he posed no threat, when the agents sprayed him with chemical weapons and then opened fire. Multiple witnesses report that Priddy's last words were asking why they were shooting him. He died on the pavement while federal agents prevented paramedics from reaching his bleeding body. This was not an isolated incident. Just 3 weeks earlier, on January 7th, ICE agent Jonathan Ross shot and killed Renee Nicole Macklin Good, a 37-year-old Minneapolis mother of three, who was sitting in her car when federal agents surrounded her vehicle. The official explanation for her death has changed multiple times, but the video evidence is clear. She was confused, frightened, and completely unarmed when Agent Ross fired multiple shots through her car window, executing her in front of her own neighborhood. Two American citizens, both 37 years old, both killed by federal agents conducting what the Trump administration calls immigration enforcement. But here is what makes this a constitutional crisis rather than just a tragedy. These killings did not happen in some remote border town or during a high-speed chase. They happened in the heart of Minneapolis during what can only be described as a federal occupation of an American city. Since December, nearly 3,000 armed federal agents have been patrolling the streets of Minneapolis and St. Paul under an operation called Metro Surge, conducting raids in schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods. According to the administration's own data, only 5% of the people they have arrested have any record of violent crime. They are not hunting cartel leaders or terrorist cells. They are terrorizing communities where families have lived peacefully for generations, and now they are killing American citizens who dare to question their authority. The political earthquake began within hours of Priddy's death. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who had been negotiating in good faith on a spending package to keep the government funded, called an emergency press conference and delivered what can only be described as a declaration of war against the Trump administration. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, with the dome illuminated behind him in the winter darkness, Schumer looked directly into the cameras and said the words that changed everything. He said the American people support law enforcement and border security, but they do not support ICE terrorizing American streets and killing American citizens. He said Congress would not send another penny to the Department of Homeland Security until the agency was reined in and overhauled. Most importantly, he said Senate Democrats were overwhelmingly united on this issue, and they would vote against any legislation that funded ICE without fundamental reforms. This was not a negotiating position. This was an ultimatum. The immediate response from the White House revealed just how completely Trump had lost control of the situation. Rather than expressing condolences for the victims or promising investigations, the administration doubled down on defending the killings. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem held a press conference where she characterized both Priddy and Good as threats to federal agents, despite overwhelming video evidence to the contrary. She used the phrase domestic terrorists to describe American citizens who were documenting immigration raids, and she promised that federal agents would continue their operations regardless of local opposition. The public reaction was swift and devastating. Polling conducted in the 48 hours after Priddy's death showed Trump's approval rating on immigration, previously his strongest issue, dropping by 8 points. Even more alarming for the administration, the polling showed that majorities of Americans now viewed the immigration enforcement operations as too harsh and doing too much. Focus groups revealed that suburban voters, particularly women, were horrified by the images coming out of Minneapolis and were beginning to turn against Trump's entire immigration agenda. But the political damage extended far beyond polling numbers. For the first time since Trump returned to office, Republican senators began publicly questioning the administration's tactics. Senator Ted Budd of North Carolina, typically a reliable Trump supporter, wrote on social media that initial rushes to judgment did not meet the standard that Americans should expect from their government officials. He was referring to Homeland Security Secretary Noam and other administration officials who had immediately labeled Priddy a domestic terrorist without conducting any investigation. Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina went even further, telling reporters that the images coming out of Minneapolis were souring the public on the Trump administration's handling of immigration more broadly. He said it was regrettable that Republicans who always lead on immigration were now losing on the issue that should be their strength. Even more damaging, Tillis specifically blamed Noam for decisions that he said were tarnishing the agency's reputation. This was not random criticism. This was a coordinated message from Republican senators who were watching their political futures crumble as the administration's immigration policies became associated with the killing of American citizens. The constitutional crisis deepened when it became clear that Trump had no legal authority for many of the tactics his agents were using in Minneapolis. A federal district judge reviewed the evidence and found that ICE had violated at least 96 separate court orders in Minnesota since the beginning of the year. 96 violations of federal court orders in just 1 month. This was not law enforcement. This was lawlessness with federal badges. The judge issued a preliminary injunction barring federal agents from arresting peaceful protesters, detaining people in their cars without cause, or using pepper spray and other non-lethal weapons against citizens who were exercising their constitutional rights. But the administration ignored the court order, continuing operations that were now explicitly illegal under federal law. By Thursday, January 29th, it became clear that the spending negotiations had reached a complete impasse. House Democrats, who had initially been willing to compromise on immigration enforcement funding, withdrew their support entirely after meeting with families of the victims. Congressional Black Caucus Chair Stephen Horsford held a press conference with Priddy's sister and Good's children, and the emotional testimony from these grieving families made it politically impossible for Democrats to vote for any bill that continued funding ICE operations without fundamental reforms. The specific reforms Democrats were demanding would transform how immigration enforcement operates in America. They wanted federal agents prohibited from wearing masks, required to use body cameras that stayed turned on during all interactions, and mandated to display clear identification at all times. They wanted an end to the roving patrols that had terrorized Minneapolis neighborhoods, stricter warrant requirements for entering homes, and independent investigations into all uses of force by federal agents. Most importantly, they wanted legal protections that would make it easier for victims and their families to pursue lawsuits against agents who violated their constitutional rights. These were not radical demands. They were basic accountability measures that local police departments across the country had adopted after their own scandals involving excessive force. But the Trump administration treated them as an attack on federal authority itself. As the Friday night deadline approached, the political maneuvering became increasingly desperate. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, trying to save his own political skin, attempted to broker a compromise that would fund most government agencies while giving lawmakers more time to negotiate reforms for the Department of Homeland Security. The plan would have funded the Pentagon, State Department, Health and Human Services, and other critical agencies through September while providing only a 2-week extension for DHS funding. This would have prevented a broader government shutdown while giving both sides time to negotiate specific reforms for immigration enforcement. For a moment, it appeared the compromise might work. Trump, facing devastating poll numbers and increasingly vocal criticism from his own party, endorsed the Senate plan. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on television to say the president was urging Congress to take action to avoid triggering a partial government shutdown. The administration appeared to be backing down from its confrontational stance, with Trump saying publicly that officials were going to de-escalate a bit in Minnesota. But then came the betrayal that no one saw coming. As senators prepared for what should have been a routine vote on the compromise package, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina suddenly placed a hold on the legislation, effectively killing any chance of avoiding a shutdown. Graham, who had been publicly supportive of some Democratic reform proposals, including body cameras and better training for federal agents, used his senatorial privilege to block the entire package over completely unrelated issues. The hold was ostensibly about language that would have repealed a provision allowing senators to sue if their phone records were collected during federal investigations, a reference to the ongoing legal challenges related to Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. But sources close to the negotiations suggest Graham's real motivation was far more political. He was reportedly under intense pressure from Trump loyalists who viewed any compromise as a betrayal of the president's immigration agenda. By blocking the deal, Graham was forcing a government shutdown that would theoretically pressure Democrats to abandon their reform demands and restore full funding for immigration enforcement operations. The gambit backfired spectacularly. Rather than pressuring Democrats to compromise, the shutdown energized them and provided powerful visual evidence that Republicans were willing to shut down the government rather than accept basic accountability for federal agents who kill American citizens. Senate Minority Leader Schumer left the Capitol late Thursday night and told reporters that Republicans needed to get their act together. The message was clear. Democrats were prepared for a prolonged fight, and they had the moral high ground in defending the rights of American citizens against an out-of-control federal agency. As the government officially shut down at midnight Friday, the immediate consequences became apparent. Critical government services began closing across the country. National parks closed their gates, federal courts postponed civil cases, and hundreds of thousands of federal employees were furloughed without pay. The Department of Defense, State Department, and Health and Human Services all suspended non-essential operations. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Financial markets, already nervous about the administration's increasingly erratic policies, responded to the shutdown with significant volatility. The dollar weakened against major foreign currencies, and bond yields spiked as investors demanded higher returns to compensate for increased political risk. The shutdown was estimated to cost the American economy approximately $2 billion per day in lost productivity and delayed transactions. But the political damage was far worse than the economic impact. For the first time in his presidency, Trump appeared to have completely lost control of his own agenda. The man who had built his political brand on the premise that he alone could fix America's problems was now presiding over a government that could not even keep itself funded. The immigration enforcement operations that were supposed to demonstrate his strength and competence had instead become a symbol of chaos and brutality. International observers watched with alarm as America's democratic institutions appeared to be breaking down under the pressure of an increasingly authoritarian presidency. NATO allies, already concerned about Trump's threats against Greenland and his attacks on European trade relationships, began quietly discussing contingency plans for a world where the United States could no longer be relied upon as a stable democratic partner. The shutdown also revealed the deeper constitutional crisis that had been building throughout Trump's second term. The president's systematic use of federal agencies to intimidate and suppress political opposition, combined with his willingness to ignore court orders and constitutional constraints, had created a situation where basic democratic governance was no longer possible. When federal agents can kill American citizens with impunity and Congress cannot perform its most basic function of funding the government, the system of checks and balances that protects democracy has fundamentally broken down. House Speaker Mike Johnson, facing intense pressure from his own caucus, attempted to project confidence that the crisis would be resolved quickly. Speaking on Sunday news programs, he repeatedly said he was confident that the House would end the shutdown by Tuesday when lawmakers returned from their scheduled recess. But behind the scenes, Johnson was facing a political nightmare. His razor-thin majority meant he could afford to lose almost no Republican votes, but moderate Republicans from competitive districts were increasingly unwilling to be associated with an administration that was killing American citizens and shutting down the government. At the same time, he could not count on Democratic support for any package that did not include significant immigration enforcement reforms. The political math simply did not work. Johnson needed Democratic votes to pass any spending bill, but Democrats were united in their refusal to fund ICE without fundamental changes. He needed Republican unity to maintain his speakership, but Republicans were increasingly divided over whether to continue supporting Trump's immigration agenda in the face of mounting public opposition. Most critically, he needed Trump's support to maintain any political viability, but Trump's demands were becoming politically impossible to fulfill. As the shutdown entered its third day, the administration began showing signs of desperation. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt went on television to say that Trump would be the decider on any policy changes related to immigration enforcement reforms, but that he was willing to negotiate with Democrats. This was a significant retreat from the administration's previous position that any restrictions on ICE operations were unacceptable. The administration even invited moderate Democratic senators to the White House to discuss their concerns and hear their proposed reforms. But these gestures came too late to prevent the political damage that was already spreading throughout the Republican Party. Polling conducted over the shutdown weekend showed Trump's approval rating dropping to its lowest point since he had taken office. More importantly, the polling showed Republicans losing ground in generic congressional ballot tests, with Democrats opening their largest lead in over a year. The shutdown was not just damaging Trump, it was threatening Republican control of Congress in the upcoming midterm elections. The crisis also exposed the administration's complete lack of strategic thinking about immigration policy. Rather than building public support for enforcement operations through careful targeting of actual criminals and transparent procedures that respected constitutional rights, the administration had chosen a strategy of maximum intimidation that inevitably led to abuses and public backlash. The killing of American citizens was not an unfortunate accident. It was the predictable result of deploying thousands of armed agents with minimal training and accountability into communities where they faced no meaningful oversight. As Monday morning arrived and the House prepared to return from recess, it became clear that the shutdown would not end quickly. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries announced that his caucus would meet to map out its next steps and reiterated that Democrats needed a robust path toward dramatic reform of the Department of Homeland Security. He said the administration could not just talk the talk about reforms, but needed to walk the walk, and that changes should begin immediately rather than being delayed for weeks of negotiations. The message was clear. Democrats were not interested in symbolic gestures or vague promises. They wanted concrete, immediate changes to how federal immigration enforcement operates, and they were prepared to keep the government shut down until they got them. This government shutdown represents far more than a typical Washington budget dispute. It is a constitutional crisis that reveals the fundamental breakdown of American democratic governance under an increasingly authoritarian presidency. When federal agents can kill American citizens with impunity, when court orders are ignored with no consequences, and when the basic functions of government cannot be performed because of political extremism, the system of checks and balances that protects democracy has failed. The question now is whether American institutions are strong enough to restore constitutional governance, or whether this crisis will accelerate the country's slide toward authoritarianism. The answer will determine not just the fate of immigration policy, but the future of American democracy itself.